She signed the papers that threw a single dad and his little girl out of their home, never imagining that just days later, she would be standing at his tiny front door with nowhere else to go. Ethan Cole had learned long ago that survival was rarely dramatic. Most days it looked like waking before sunrise, pulling on the same faded work jacket, and stepping quietly around the tiny apartment so he would not wake his 7-year-old daughter, Lila. Their home sat on the third floor of an aging building with cracked paint, a stubborn radiator, and pipes that rattled through the night. But to Ethan, it was still a blessing, because it was the one place in the city he could still barely afford. He worked every job he could find, repairing cabinets, patching drywall, fixing broken porch steps, even painting fences on weekends, anything honest that kept food on the table and Lila and her little school 3 blocks away. He made breakfast with the same care other men might bring to expensive gifts, cutting toast into stars when she was sad, drawing smiley faces on pancakes when she needed cheering up, and pretending not to notice when his own coffee was just hot water and the last spoon of grounds. Lila never complained. She was all bright eyes, missing front tooth, and crayon drawings taped across the apartment walls, each one showing the same thing: herself, her father, and a yellow sun hanging over a home that looked much grander on paper than it did in real life. To Ethan, that was enough. Their life was small, but it was warm, and warmth had become its own kind of wealth. Then, one gray afternoon, everything shifted with the arrival of black luxury cars in front of the building. Neighbors peered through curtains, children paused their games on the sidewalk, and a nervous silence spread through the hallways as sharply dressed assistants and lawyers followed a woman inside whose presence seemed to suck all softness from the air. Victoria Hale, Billionaire real estate CEO, walked through the lobby in heels that clicked like a countdown, her expression cool and unreadable as she examined the worn staircases, old mailboxes, and tired walls with the detached precision of someone evaluating numbers instead of lives. Rumors spread quickly that she had bought the building and intended to convert it into upscale apartments for wealthy tenants. By evening, panic had already begun. Mothers whispered on the stairwell, an elderly man argued with the manager, and Ethan stood in the hall outside his apartment, reading the temporary notice posted downstairs with a knot tightening in his chest. The next morning, tenants were gathered in the courtyard when Victoria returned to address them with her team. She spoke clearly, professionally, almost elegantly, announcing renovation plans, timelines, and relocation terms as though she were unveiling an exciting opportunity instead of tearing apart a community. When desperate voices rose around her, she did not flinch. Ethan finally stepped forward, not with anger, but with the tired dignity of a father who would run out of easy options. He explained that many families there lived paycheck to paycheck, that his daughter's school was nearby, that finding another place in so little time would be impossible. For one suspended second, Victoria met his eyes. He hoped she might see what was standing in front of her, not a problem, not a delay, but a man holding together a child's whole world with his bare hands. Then Lila slipped beside him, clutching his arm, and asked in a small, trembling voice, "Daddy, do we have to leave our home?" Ethan felt her fingers tighten around him, and though Victoria looked directly at the little girl, the only change in her face was the faintest hardening, as if compassion itself were something she had trained out of her. She said that business decisions could not be ruled by emotion, turned to her assistant, and walked away before anyone could answer Lila's question. 3 days later, an official eviction notice appeared on Ethan's door, bright and final against the peeling paint. And as he stood staring at it in silence, he realized the life he had fought so hard to make feel safe for his daughter had just been shattered by a woman who would probably never remember his name. Ethan did not let Lila see him break, not when he folded the eviction notice and slipped it into his pocket, not when he spent the next 2 days calling landlords who either demanded impossible deposits or refused to rent to a single father with uneven income. And not even when he sat in his truck one night, gripping the steering wheel so hard his hands ached because every door in the city seemed to close the moment he mentioned his budget. In front of Lila, he made it sound like a temporary adventure, a little trip somewhere quiet, a chance to see the stars instead of streetlights, and she tried bravely to believe him, though her eyes kept drifting around the apartment as if she were memorizing every corner before it disappeared. On the final morning, Ethan packed their lives into old cardboard boxes, Leela's stuffed rabbit, their chipped dishes, his late wife's framed photograph, school books, winter blankets, and the crayon drawings that had turned those tired walls into something sacred. Neighbors carried what they could to the curb, some crying openly, others moving with the numb silence of people who had no strength left for anger. Ethan kept his face steady while loading the truck, lifting mattresses, taping shut boxes, and thanking the few residents who offered help. But inside, he was unraveling. Leela stood beside the truck, holding a flower pot she had painted at school, her lower lip trembling as she asked if the new place would still feel like home. Ethan crouched in front of her, brushed a loose curl from her face, and told her home was wherever the two of them were together, even if the walls were different. It was the kind of answer fathers give when truth is too cruel for a child. With nowhere affordable left in the city, Ethan drove them out toward a tiny patch of rural land he had inherited years earlier from his grandfather, a forgotten property he had never imagined needing. The drive grew quieter as buildings gave way to empty roads, open fields, and weathered fences, until they finally turned onto a narrow dirt path lined with weeds and reached the house. It was smaller than Ethan remembered, and in worse condition, paint peeling from the siding, porch steps sagging, one shutter hanging loose, and tall grass swallowing half the yard. But it still stood, and for that alone he was grateful. Leela stared at it from the truck window with frightened uncertainty, and Ethan forced a smile before carrying her inside. The place smelled like dust, old wood, and abandonment. Cobwebs hum in the corners, the kitchen sink leaked, and the living room floorboards creaked under every step. Yet sunlight still found its way through the grimy windows in soft golden strips that made the emptiness feel less cruel. Ethan got to work immediately, because action was easier than despair. He opened windows, swept floors, patched a broken latch, and rigged the plumbing just enough to make the water run without flooding the kitchen. By evening, his shirt was soaked with sweat and dust streaked his arms, but there were 2 made-up beds, a pot of soup warming on the stove, and one little lamp glowing in the corner. Leela walked through the house quietly at first, then began placing her drawings on the walls again, one by one, as if she were stitching life back into a wounded place. She picked wildflowers from the yard and set them in a cracked jar on the table, then sat beside Ethan on the porch steps as the sun dipped low over the fields. For the first time in days, there was no city noise, no shouting tenants, no echo of Victoria Hale's cold voice in the hallway. Only crickets, wind through the grass, and the ache of starting over. Ethan wrapped an arm around his daughter and looked at the broken little house before them, knowing it was far from the life she deserved, but also knowing it was the only thing he had left to give. Meanwhile, miles away in the glowing heart of the city, Victoria raised a glass in celebration as reporters praised her latest acquisition, never once imagining that while she toasted another profitable victory under crystal chandeliers, the man she had evicted was teaching his daughter how to call a collapsing house home. While Ethan spent his days rebuilding a life from splintered wood and stubborn hope, Victoria Hale stood at the top of her empire, believing she had once again proven that control was the same as success. The city's most influential investors filled the top floor of Hale Urban Development for a celebration dinner, praising the newest acquisition that had pushed her company deeper into the luxury market. Champagne shimmered under chandelier light, cameras flashed, and Victoria wore confidence like armor, every polished word and measured smile hiding the exhaustion beneath. For years, she had built herself into someone untouchable, a woman who could walk through protests, pleas, and public criticism without wavering, because hesitation had always seemed more dangerous than cruelty. Her business partner, Damian Cross, stood at her side throughout the evening with his usual smooth charm, lifting toasts in her honor and speaking as if they were equal architects of a brilliant future. To everyone watching, they looked unstoppable. But long after the guests had gone and the city lights flickered below her office windows, that illusion shattered. Victoria returned to her penthouse after midnight to find dozens of missed calls, emergency alerts, and a flood of messages from board members demanding immediate explanations. Within minutes, she learned that confidential files had been leaked to the press, documents connecting her name to illegal pressure tactics, hidden financial transfers, and questionable tenant removals across multiple properties. The headlines spread faster than she could breathe, painting her as the cold face of predatory greed. Although some of the records were real, others had been twisted, rearranged, and timed with surgical precision to make her the sole target. By dawn, financial regulators were circling, investors were panicking, and the board had called an emergency vote. Victoria arrived at headquarters ready to fight, but the atmosphere had already changed. The same people who once stood when she entered the room now avoided her eyes. Lawyers whispered in corners. Assistants stepped aside as if disgrace were contagious. Damien sat at the far end of the conference table wearing an expression of practiced regret, pretending to be shocked while quietly guiding the narrative against her. He suggested temporary removal for the good of the company, speaking in calm corporate language that sounded like concern but carried the weight of betrayal. Victoria stared at him in disbelief as the truth hit with brutal clarity. He had planned this, fed the press, manipulated the board, and used her harsh reputation as the perfect weapon to destroy her. By noon, her access to company funds was restricted. By afternoon, the board voted her out. By evening, security escorted her from the building she had spent years conquering. Outside, reporters swarmed like vultures, shouting questions about fraud, evictions, and corruption. Cameras followed her to the curb, where she stood for one disorienting moment, with no driver, no staff, and no one willing to step forward. Even the penthouse that had once overlooked the city like a throne was no longer hers. Her access code failed before she could step inside, and the doorman, red-faced with discomfort, informed her that all entry privileges had been suspended pending legal review. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria Hale had nowhere to go that was safe, private, or truly hers. So she drove. She left behind the towers she had once ruled, the flashing cameras, and the city that suddenly treated her like a virus. Rain gathered on the windshield as daylight faded, and the roads became emptier with every mile. But she kept moving because motion felt easier than stopping to face what remained of her life. Her phone battery died. Her navigation cut out. Then, deep along a rural road lined with dark fields and whispering trees, her luxury car sputtered, lurched, and went still in the storm. Victoria sat gripping the steering wheel as rain hammered the roof, her breath shallow, her carefully engineered world reduced to silence and darkness. In the distance, through the blurred curtain of rain, she spotted a faint porch light glowing from the only house nearby, and with no pride left to protect, she stepped out into the storm and began walking toward the one door fate had chosen for her. By the time Victoria reached the porch, rain had soaked through her coat, her hair clung to her face, and the sharp elegance that once made boardrooms fall silent had been washed into something painfully human. She lifted a trembling hand and knocked, once, then again, each second stretching longer as thunder rolled above the fields. Inside, Ethan had just settled Leela into bed after another long evening of patched chores and quiet reassurances about school, about home, about tomorrow. When the knocking came, he frowned, wiped his hands on a rag, and opened the door expecting maybe a stranded driver or a neighbor from down the road. Instead, the porch light fell across the face of the woman who had shattered his life. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Ethan stared at Victoria Hale in disbelief, his mind struggling to reconcile the ruthless CEO from the apartment courtyard with the drenched, pale woman standing before him now, clutching the edges of her coat like armor that had finally failed her. Victoria's lips parted, but whatever prepared explanation she had meant to give dissolved under the weight of humiliation. All that came out was the truth. She had nowhere else to go. Ethan's jaw tightened instantly. Every sleepless night, every cardboard box, every tear Leela had tried to hide came rushing back with such force that his first instinct was to shut the door in her face and let the storm do what he no longer could. Before he could move, a small voice drifted from the hallway behind him. Leela, sleepy and barefoot in her pajamas, peeked around his side and looked up at the stranger on their porch. She did not recognize the name or the power, only the trembling in Victoria's hands and the raw fear in her eyes.
"Daddy," she whispered, tugging at his sleeve, "why is she crying?" The question landed harder than anger. Ethan looked down at his daughter, then back at the woman who had once stood untouched while families begged her for mercy, and he felt the war inside himself deepen. Victoria lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes anymore because the child's innocence made her shame unbearable. She expected rejection, she deserved it, but after a long silence, Ethan stepped aside just enough to let her in, his voice low and firm as he said she could stay for one night until the storm passed. Victoria crossed the threshold like someone entering a world she had no right to touch. The house was tiny, worn and simple, patched furniture, a small kitchen, a handmade shelf of books, children's drawings on the wall, and the scent of soup still lingering in the air. It should have felt beneath her old standards, but instead it felt intimate in a way her penthouse never had. Ethan handed her a towel without softness, keeping a careful distance as if kindness itself might cost too much. Leela disappeared for a moment and returned carrying her favorite faded blanket, the one Ethan had wrapped around her on cold nights since she was little. She held it out to Victoria with solemn generosity and said, "You can use this if you're scared." Victoria stared at the blanket as though it were something impossible, then took it with shaking hands and whispered a thank you that barely sounded like her own voice. Ethan watched the exchange from across the room, his expression unreadable, because part of him wanted to hold on to anger, and part of him was witnessing a version of Victoria no newspaper, courtroom, or corporate enemy had ever seen. That night she slept curled on the narrow couch beneath Leela's blanket, while wind rattled the windows and rain tapped against the roof, and though Ethan told himself she would be gone by morning, something had already shifted the moment he opened the door and saw the woman who once held so much power, standing powerless beneath his porch light.
Morning in the tiny house arrived without ceremony. Only the pale light of dawn slipping through thin curtains and the quiet clatter of Ethan already moving through the kitchen before the sun had fully risen. Victoria woke stiff on the narrow couch, wrapped in Leela's faded blanket, and for a few disorienting seconds she forgot who she was supposed to be. Then memory returned all at once. The scandal, the betrayal, the storm, and the unbearable fact that she was waking under the roof of the man she had once pushed out of his home without remorse. She sat up slowly, listening to the unfamiliar sounds around her, a kettle beginning to whistle, floorboards creaking beneath Ethan's work boots, and Leela humming to herself from the small bedroom as if hardship had never managed to steal the softness from her. The house itself felt almost embarrassingly honest in daylight. Nothing was polished, nothing hidden. The patched curtains, the worn table, the repaired cabinet doors, the tiny shelf of secondhand books, all of it carried visible marks of use and care, unlike the flawless surfaces Victoria had spent her life surrounding herself with. When she stepped into the kitchen, Ethan barely looked at her. He stood at the counter making breakfast with the mechanical calm of someone who had trained himself to function even when tired, angry, or afraid. He set a plain mug of coffee near her without warmth and told her the phone lines sometimes worked better from the porch if she wanted to try calling for help again. Victoria murmured a thank you, though the words felt small and inadequate in this place. Leela bounded in a moment later, bright and unguarded, and greeted Victoria with the same easy kindness she offered everyone, asking if she had slept better now that the storm was gone. Victoria, who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, found herself unable to answer a child without emotion tightening in her throat. The day unfolded awkwardly at first. Ethan went outside to repair a broken fence and split wood, clearly intending to keep his distance, while Victoria remained inside, unsure what to do with hands that had always passed work to someone else. But staying still felt unbearable, so she began with the simplest things she could find: washing the breakfast dishes, wiping down the table, folding blankets. None of it came naturally. She dropped a spoon, splashed water across the counter, and nearly broke a chipped plate when Leela cheerfully offered to show her where things belonged. Instead of mocking her clumsiness, the little girl giggled and called it practice, as though failure were nothing shameful. That word echoed in Victoria's mind the rest of the day. Practice. Not weakness, not humiliation, just the beginning of learning something she should have understood long ago. Later, Leela pulled her outside to help paint old flower pots Ethan had salvaged from a shed, and Victoria found herself sitting in the yard beneath open sky, wearing one of Ethan's old shirts over her clothes to avoid ruining them, while a 7-year-old explained which colors made flowers look happy. From the porch, Ethan watched with a guarded expression as Victoria carefully painted shaky yellow petals onto cracked clay and listened to Leela chatter about school, birds, and how the stars looked bigger out here than in the city. The sight unsettled him because it did not match the woman he thought he knew. That evening, after dinner eaten around the tiny kitchen table, Ethan finally spoke more than a few practical words. He asked Victoria if she had ever once thought about what happened to the families after the eviction notices were delivered. The room went still. Leela, sensing a change she did not understand, quietly carried her plate to the sink and slipped away. Victoria looked down at her hands, stained faintly with paint, and for the first time in years she did not reach for a defense. She admitted, in a voice stripped of pride, that she had trained herself not to think about people for too long because numbers were easier than faces, profit easier than pain, distance easier than guilt. Ethan's expression hardened at that, but he did not interrupt. So she kept going, confessing that standing in this house, seeing how much care he built into even the smallest things, was making it impossible to hide from the truth anymore. She had called herself strong because she never bent, never softened, never let emotion interfere with ambition, but now she was beginning to understand that what she had really built was not strength at all. It was emptiness dressed as power. Ethan held her gaze for a long moment, and though he did not forgive her, the silence between them changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers bound by misfortune. It was the silence of two wounded people standing at the edge of something painful, honest, and impossible to ignore.
The fragile peace inside Ethan's tiny house did not last long, because the world Victoria had tried to outrun finally found her at the edge of the fields where she had begun learning how small, honest lives were held together. 3 days after her first real conversation with Ethan, a black SUV rolled up the dirt road just as the sun was lowering behind the trees, and the sight of it sent a chill through Victoria before anyone even stepped out. Damien's men came dressed in expensive coats and practiced smiles, carrying folders and threats disguised as solutions. They told Victoria the board was willing to let the worst of the scandal fade if she signed away her remaining ownership rights, accepted public blame, and disappeared quietly. When she hesitated, their politeness hardened into pressure, then intimidation, making it clear they had not come all this way expecting refusal. Leela was inside at the table drawing, unaware of the danger wrapped in calm voices, and Ethan stepped onto the porch the moment he sensed Victoria's fear. He placed himself between her and the men without a second thought, not because he had forgotten what she had done, but because he refused to let cruelty cross his threshold again. Damien's representatives sneered at the tiny house, at Ethan's work-worn clothes, at the absurdity of a man like him standing in their way. But Ethan did not move. His voice stayed low and steady as he told them to leave his property. Victoria watched him in stunned silence because for the first time in her life, someone was protecting her when she had nothing left to offer in return. That moment broke the last pieces of the old woman she had been. After the SUV finally pulled away with a warning that they would be back, Victoria went inside shaking, but she was no longer shaking from fear alone. She was ashamed of the life she had spent admiring power without conscience, and she knew running was no longer an option. That night, seated at Ethan's scarred kitchen table with Leela asleep in the next room, she opened the final encrypted files Damien had never realized she still possessed. They contained proof of everything: his secret transfers, manipulated contracts, falsified reports, and the deliberate leak that had destroyed her while shielding him. Ethan sat across from her as she sorted through the evidence, not saying much, only offering quiet help and steady presence. And with each document, she felt something stronger than ambition take root. By morning, Victoria had made her decision. She returned to the city, not in triumph but in truth, and stood before cameras, lawyers, and board members with a humility no one had ever associated with her name. She exposed Damien publicly, handed over the evidence, and admitted her own failures without excuse.
She confessed that while she had not committed every crime pinned to her, she had still built success on policies that treated struggling families like obstacles instead of human beings. The honesty stunned the public almost as much as the scandal itself. Damien fell fast once the proof surfaced. The board turned on him, investigations widened, and the empire he thought he had stolen collapsed under the weight of his own corruption. But Victoria's real victory came afterward, when she used every remaining ounce of influence and wealth not to rebuild her throne, but to repair what she could. She established a housing relief fund for displaced tenants, reversed unjust actions where possible, and helped create protections for low-income families so fewer people would suffer what Ethan and Leela had endured. It cost her money, status, and the old image she once guarded more fiercely than her soul, but for the first time her power created something decent. Weeks later, when the headlines began to fade and the city once again offered her polished opportunities, Victoria drove back down the quiet dirt road to the tiny house. She stepped out carrying no assistants, no contracts, no mask, only herself. Leela spotted her first and ran laughing across the yard, throwing her arms around her legs as if she had been expecting this all along. Ethan stood on the porch, still cautious, still wounded, but no longer closed. Victoria looked at him, then at the home that had once sheltered her shame and rebuilt her heart, and said softly that she had been offered a way back to everything she used to want, but none of it felt like enough anymore. Ethan asked why she had come back, and with tears bright in her eyes, she looked at the patched walls, the little garden Leela had planted, and the man who had shown her more strength in hardship than anyone in luxury ever had, then answered that this was the first place she had ever learned the difference between being powerful and being rich. In the end, the ruthless CEO who once evicted him did not return to reclaim control of her old world. She returned to choose a new one built not from towers and titles, but from forgiveness, redemption, and the kind of love that had been waiting for her all along in the smallest house she had ever seen. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for Drew Daily Stories, where every story brings drama, emotion, redemption, and unforgettable love. And tell us in the comments, if you were Ethan, would you forgive her?